Hello, hello, brothers. Welcome back to the Savage Gentleman, where we challenge men to rise, to lead, and to live with strength and clarity. Excuse me, I'm Pastor Benjamin Wilson, and you're tuned into another powerful episode in our series, the series that we've been talking about for the last several weeks, The Lion's Whisper, hearing God's voice in a noisy world. We've been unpacking how God speaks and how we can recognize his voice in the midst of life's challenges and life's chaos. But today, we have to talk about a very crucial issue. What's blocking the signal? Why can't we hear him clearly? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been on a video call with someone, whether it was a Zoom meeting, whatever, even FaceTime, but the connection keeps glitching? 1 second, they're crystal clear. The next, their face is frozen, their words are delayed, and you're left saying, hold on a second, can you repeat that? I missed what it is that you're saying. I have a bad signal. You know that they're talking, but the interference is so strong that you're struggling to piece together what they're actually saying. That's exactly how many men feel in their spiritual lives. God is speaking, but there's too much static, too much noise, too many distractions, too much interference, whether it's from the world, our own thoughts, or the enemy. Let's think about that for a second. In the midst of that particular moment, in the midst when you're having that bad connection, what do? You don't just give up on the call, do you? No. You move, you adjust, you find a way to get to a better place, to get to a better reception. That's what we're doing today. That's what we're doing in this episode. We're cutting through the interference so that you can hear God with absolute clarity. Over the next few minutes, what we're going to do is we're going to identify the sources of spiritual static. We're going to identify what's distorting God's voice in your life. Then we're going to filter the noise, how to shut down the distractions and fine tune your spiritual reception. And then finally, align your life for uninterrupted divine communication. Why? So you can not just hear God, but confidently follow his voice. If you've ever felt like you're straining to hear from God, if you've ever wondered, why does it feel like I can't get a clear word from him? Brothers, then this episode is for you. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to lean in, and we're going to cut through the static. There's a reason so many men struggle to hear from God and hear him clearly. It's not because God is silent. It's not because God is avoiding us. No, it's because there's interference clouding our connection. If you've ever been in a room full of people talking at the same time, brothers, you know how difficult it is to focus on one voice, especially even if it's the person next to you. That's what happens spiritually. When we live in a world of constant input, of constant noise, noise is surrounding us from the moment that we wake up to the time that we go to bed. Hearing God's voice isn't about trying harder. It's about removing the distractions that keep drowning him out. And that starts with identifying the static that is in our lives. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break this down by answering the question, what exactly is this static? And how is it affecting the way that I hear God? There's a story in Luke, the parable of the sower, Luke 8. One of the verses speaks to seed that fell on thorns, and it says that these are which grew up and it was choked out, or weeds grew among the thorns and it choked out the plant. The thorns stand for those who hear, but as they go on, or the seed that fell on the thorns stands for those that hear the word, but as they grow, as they mature, the seed gets choked out by the cares of this world. They get choked out by the worries of this world, even the pleasure or the riches of the world. Regardless of what it is, the seed that is planted in them somehow gets choked out. This verse speaks to the reality that distractions don't just appear overnight. They grow alongside what God is doing in your life. If they are left unchecked, they will choke out his voice, causing distortion, delay, and even complete silence. One of the things I love about that verse, when you look at it, it didn't say that the seed fell among the thorns and then it grew up and then after it was grown, then the thorns came. No, it said it grew among the thorns. It grew in the midst of it. It grew up in the world that was surrounding it. It grew up in the noise. The seed matured in the noise, but it was choked out by the noise. It doesn't happen overnight. These things grow with us. And a lot of times we get caught up thinking that things started all of a sudden. No, the noise has always been there. But the fact that it's always been there sometimes gets overlooked because we're not focusing on trying to hear God's voice. It's only when we focus in on intentionally trying to hear God's voice that all of a sudden we start to notice all of the distractions. And in that particular moment, the distractions get even stronger. The first way static interferes is by distorting God's voice. You hear something, but it's unclear or twisted. Imagine getting a text message where autocorrect has completely altered the meaning of the sentence. That's never happened to you. It's happened to me. You're left reading words that look familiar, but the original message has been lost. This is exactly how static distorts what God is saying. Instead of receiving his word with clarity, it gets mixed with fear, past experiences, and false assumptions. Someone can receive a word from God about stepping into leadership, but instead of hearing, I have called you to lead, the static of insecurity and past failures distorted into you're not ready. The Bible gives us a clear example of this in Genesis. When Satan approached Eve, he did not introduce a new idea. He simply twisted what God had already spoken. The static of deception caused her to question what was already true. If you are not careful, brothers, unchecked status will cause you to hear God's voice through a lens of fear instead of faith, and through doubt instead of trust. This kind of distortion doesn't just affect what we hear, it affects how we act. When we have an unclear or altered understanding of what God is saying, we hesitate, we overthink, and we even second guess the very instructions that were meant to bring clarity and direction. Men who should be stepping into their purpose are instead caught in circles of confusion, not because God hasn't spoken, but because his voice has been drowned out by false interpretations. If you've ever questioning whether you heard God right or feeling stuck because you don't trust what you're sensing, then it's time to address the static that is distorting his voice in your life. The second way static interferes is by delaying God's voice. This is when distractions keep you from hearing what God is saying at the right time. You pray for direction, but the answer feels delayed. Not because God is silent, but because your spiritual reception is too weak to pick up what he is saying. It's like trying to follow GPS directions, but only receiving them after you've already missed the turn. Brothers, I can't tell you, there was a moment not too long ago, I got frustrated with my GPS because, granted, it goes into listening and making sure you're following directions and not getting distracted. The GPS was giving me directions to a destination, and I missed a turn. And as it was recalibrating, as it was redirecting, it told me turn right but at the time it told me to turn right, I had already passed the street. Not only had I already passed the street, but I was in the left lane and it was telling me to turn right. So the very next thing that I did was I made sure I could get over into the right lane so that the next time it told me to turn right, I'd be able to make that right turn. The only issue was when it rerouted and told me to turn right, I was already passing that street again. And so what I ended up doing was having to slow down, really pay attention, and not just watch the road, but watch the GPS. So that it's not just hearing, but I'm watching the direction, I'm watching my surroundings so that I know what to do. If you've ever been in that moment, you know how frustrated it can be. You end up rerouting your entire journey, taking a longer time, a more difficult path sometimes, because you were unable to receive the instruction when it was first given. This happened to the Israelites in the middle of the wilderness. Their journey should have taken 11 days. If you've been in church, you've heard this. But because they kept allowing static to drown out God's voice, 11 days became 40 years. When God speaks, his timing is just as important as his message. The static of busyness, overcommitment, and distraction can cause you to miss the moment he is trying to guide you in. When we allow distractions to dominate our focus, we lose sight of what God is trying to do in the moment. Think about how often men push off addressing their spiritual lives because they're too busy grinding at work, keeping up with commitments, or just trying to make it through the day. If the enemy can't stop you outright, he'll just keep you busy enough to delay your obedience. Some of the biggest regrets in life come not from making the wrong decision, but from failing to act when God was leading. If you're always waiting for the perfect moment to listen, you'll miss the window of opportunity that God has already placed right in front of you. That's the second way. The third way static interferes is by diminishing God's voice. This is when the interference becomes so constant that you stop hearing altogether. At first, it starts subtly. The voice of God gets a little quieter as other voices get louder. You may not even notice it at first, but over time, if the static is never removed, his voice becomes so faint that it isn't that it isn't long that is no longer recognizable. This happened to Samson. Yeah, Samson. He ignored God's warnings so many times that the spirit left him, and when it did, he didn't even realize it happened. The static of compromise had diminished God's voice in his life to the point that he was completely unaware of God's absence. Diminished reception leads to dullness of spirit. The more we ignore God's voice, the harder it becomes to recognize. Many men aren't outright rejecting God, but they've turned him out so much that they no longer hear him when he's speaking. This is a very dangerous place to be because without his direction, we rely on our own wisdom, which is limited and flawed. The longer we allow static to dominate, the harder it becomes to reconnect. That's why clearing the static isn't an option. Brothers, it's a necessity. One of the most frustrating things in life is knowing something is important, but struggling to focus on it. If you've ever been in a loud restaurant trying to hold a deep conversation, you know how exhausting it is to fight through the noise just to hear the other person. You're leaning in, straining to catch every word because there's so much noise from everything else going on around you. This is exactly what happens in our spiritual lives. God isn't whispering to confuse us. He's calling us to lean in, cut through the distraction, and prioritize his voice above everything else. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your hearts, for everything you do flows from it. That's not just poetic wisdom. That's a battle strategy. If your heart is unguarded, if your mind is left exposed to whatever the world throws at it, then your ability to hear God will always be compromised. Guarding your heart isn't about building walls. It's setting boundaries. It's about deciding what gets access to your spirit and what doesn't. You can't hear God clearly if you're not drowning out the noises, the toxic influences, the environment, the spiritual junk food that has been flowing into your life. You have to be intentional about what you allow in. Your ability to hear God isn't just about discipline, though. It's about what you're consuming. We live in an era where information overload is constant. It's a real thing. Social media, news, entertainment, everywhere you turn, there's something competing for your attention, and in many times winning. And if we're not careful, these voices start shaping our thoughts more than the word of God. Romans 12:2, and you've heard me say this often, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That means transformation. Real lasting change only happens when we reset, refocus, and clear out the noise that's been keeping us distracted. We also need to talk about being intentional and intentional stillness. Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. Many men struggle with stillness because we've been conditioned to believe that busyness equals productivity. But if you're too busy to hear from God, then you're just running in circles. You're on a treadmill. You're not going anywhere. Stillness is a discipline, and it's in the quiet moments that God reveals the deepest truths. Jesus himself modeled this. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places where he could pray. If the Son of God made intentional time to get away from the noise and to seek the Father, what makes us think that we don't need to do the same thing? Here's a challenge for you. What distractions do you need to shut down? What noise is keeping you from hearing God clearly? Maybe it's certain conversations, certain habits, or even your own negative self-talk. If something is blocking your ability to hear the voice of God, then it's time to cut it out. Filtering the noise isn't just about avoiding distractions. It's about making room for what matters. Filtering the noise is a crucial step, but it's not enough by itself. It's enough. It's not enough just to remove the distractions. You have to actively align yourself to hear God clearly. Just like an athlete doesn't just stop eating junk food, but replaces it with intentional nutrition, we don't just cut out the noise. We create an environment where God's voice is the loudest and clearest in our lives. Alignment happens when we cultivate consistent spiritual practices that make space for God's voice. This means prioritizing prayer, immersing yourself in scripture, and surrounding yourself with godly counsel. John 10:27, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. Hearing God isn't as accidental, it's intentional. If you want to recognize God's voice, you have to build a life that expects him to speak. That means committing to daily disciplines that keep your spiritual ears sharp. Prayer isn't just a last resort, it's your first line of communication. Reading the scriptures isn't just a Sunday routine, it's your lifeline. And surrounding yourself with godly men who sharpen you, challenge you, and hold you accountable isn't optional, it's absolutely necessary. Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. When you align your life with these principles, you stop treating God's voice as a rare occurrence and start walking in daily conversation with him. The more you engage with him, the more naturally you'll recognize his whisper amid the noise. So what does it look like to align your life so that when God speaks, you don't just hear, you move? It's about obedience. James 1:22 says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. If God speaks and you don't respond, you're not just missing his voice, you're missing your next step. Alignment isn't passive, brothers. It's not passive. It's active. It's active participation in God's direction. It's being in step with him so that when he calls, you're ready to answer. It's eliminating the distractions, tuning in, and moving when God speaks to you. My question is, are you aligned? Are you positioned to hear God's voice without interference? If not, it's time to take action. Let's remove the static, clear the distractions, and step into a life of clarity, conviction, and confident obedience. Now, here's my challenge for you for this week. I want you to take inventory. I challenge you to take inventory of your life. Identify one major source of static. Maybe it's social media, endless distractions, unhealthy relationships, or even your own internal noise of doubt and fear. Once you've identified it, brothers, take a bold step. Cut it down, shut it off, and replace it with something that sharpens your ability to hear God. After you've done that, I want you to intentionally prioritize stillness. Spend time in silence, no distractions, no noise, just you and God. Even if it's just 10 minutes a day, create the habit of quieting your soul before God. And then finally, align your life for clear reception. That means getting into the word of God with expectation, surrounding yourself with godly counsel, and committing to obedience when God speaks. This week, brothers, don't just listen, take action. Clear the static, filter the noise, and align yourself with God's frequency. Brothers, hearing God's voice isn't just for a select few. It's for each one of us. But you have to be willing to fight through the static, tune in, and take action. God is speaking. The question is, are we listening? Brothers, if this episode has challenged you, encouraged you, or given you clarity, I want you to do three things. 1, like. 2, share. 3, subscribe. Let's spread the message and help more men cut through the noise in their lives and hear God clearly. And if you haven't already, I want you to connect with us. Join the conversation, engage in the movement, and let's walk this thing out together. Through the next time, brothers, be savage, be gentle, be extraordinary.